Hello and welcome to this Astranti bite-size information video. As you can see, the idea behind today's video is to learn the theory behind a key subject that comes up a lot in all the E pillar, in all of the exams from E1 right the way through to E3. And in this video, we're going to learn all the basic theory you would need to help you pass all of those exams. Now, of course, the difference between the exams will be the way in which that theory is tested. But I'm going to give you more information about the different approaches to the different exams once we've explored the theory. So let's get going with Mendelow's matrix. So before we do anything else, let's bring up the matrix itself. And in fact, let's have a look at the overall makeup of it before I zoom in. So we can see that along the left hand side we've got the power going from low to high. Now we've already talked about stakeholder power, haven't we? And then across the top we've got interest. Now we're going to come to that in a second, but again it's going from low to high. And then in the actual matrix quadrants itself we've got minimal effort, we've got keep informed, keep satisfied, and key player, keep close. So remember, Mendelow's matrix is all about mapping out strategies for organizations so that they can manage their stakeholders or the different groups of stakeholders effectively. So let's just make sure we understand what stakeholder power means. We should do, we've just had a section on it, but it is the ability of a stakeholder to influence an organization and affect its decision making. So for example, a CEO has high power because of course they're helping to shape the strategy of an organization and affect its decision making, whereas a part-time employee wouldn't have much power because they wouldn't have much responsibility to change or affect the strategies or the decision making of an organization. And of course the other criteria on Mendelow's matrix is interest. Now interest is all about how much interest does the stakeholder have in the organization, because if they've got a lot of interest, then the organization is going to have to increase its level of communication with them. And so if we think about employees again, the majority of employees will have little power, but of course they will have a lot of interest in the business because they care about where their next paycheck is coming from. They want to make sure that the business is performing well so they have a stable job. And so it's important that the organization communicates its plans to the employees, even though they don't have much power, so as the organization can retain the loyalty and motivation of the stakeholders. And so by using those two criteria, the stakeholders are categorized to minimal effort or keep informed or one of the quadrants, and then treated differently depending on where they feature on the matrix. So let's go and have a look at these four quadrants in more detail. And we're going to start with minimal effort, because this is where, as you can see, stakeholders have a low interest and low power in the business. So let's have an example. Now we've talked about the local community being an external stakeholder. And that's because the local community isn't really that interested in the business, in its policies, in its procedures, in its long-term strategy, and it has no influence. In fact, probably the only time it really would have an interest is if the business did something that affected the local community. So for instance, if it suddenly built a new production facility in the middle of a residential area, then of course that interest would change. But as a general rule, the interest for the local community would be low. And so remember, this matrix is all about placing stakeholders in the appropriate quadrant, so the organization knows how to communicate them, in a sense how to manage them. So if we stick with our local community stakeholder as an example, the minimal effort criteria would basically mean the organization would have to give them the basic information to meet their needs. So let's imagine there was some kind of fairly unobtrusive business building works, going on in the local community's area. Then it'd be nice of the organization, might be pertinent for the organization to provide information to the community on what they're planning to do, how they're planning to do it, how it might affect their local transport links temporarily, etc., just so the situation doesn't escalate. Because if they don't provide that basic information, then suddenly this stakeholder group may become more interested. And then suddenly they might get other bodies involved, such as the local council, saying, why weren't we told about this? I don't think this is appropriate. And then the situation can spiral. So this is all about maintaining and making sure that stakeholders have the appropriate information so that the business or the organization can get buy-in, if you remember that term from earlier on, so they can get support from their stakeholders and trying to avoid conflict as far as possible. Okay, so that's minimal effort, that's low interest, low power. If we slightly zoom back to the full matrix now, we're going to go to the next one along, which is high power. So it's high interest, low power. Keep informed is high interest, low power. I'm starting to confuse myself now. Now, I've already touched on this stakeholder in my example, but a stakeholder that might have high interest in a company, but low power, maybe a full-time employee. And of course, this wouldn't be a senior employee that had decision-making abilities because they would have high power. This is just a standard full-time employee. Now, of course, as I said earlier, they're interested in the policies, the procedures, and the pay in the organization because it affects them directly. So they're very interested in any changes of policy. And we can see, can't we, quite a contrast between them and the local community. Employees are going to be directly affected day to day on what the organization decides. And any strategic changes, of course, they're going to be affected by as well. So let's imagine we've got an employee working in a factory. They would, of course, be very concerned if the factory were planning to close and the factory was having to enact a redundancy program. But an individual full-time employee, however, has little power. So if they said, well, I'm not happy with this planned redundancy program, I wanted to stop, what do you think the organization would do? Well, they probably would do very little. They'd probably say, goodbye. We're going to employ someone else who does agree. That one individual stakeholder has little power but high interest in the organization. So remember, this matrix is about how the company should communicate with them. And with a high interest, low power stakeholder, the organization should make sure they regularly communicate with them, especially in the things that are of interest. So, for example, the employees would be especially interested in a redundancy program because, of course, the effects are really far-reaching and really could affect their personal lives. So, of course, in that situation, especially regular communication would be vital. And, of course, we've talked about an individual employee not having much power. And one of the reasons why an organization would want to regularly communicate with them is so that individual employee doesn't become dissatisfied and decides to get together with other employees in a bid to increase their power. Because suddenly, if you've got all your employees, your full-time employees, and they're unionized, suddenly they have a lot more power. So one of the aims of this matrix is to keep the stakeholders satisfied so they don't seek to increase their power. Okay, let's zoom out slightly from the matrix again, and we're going to zoom into, let me get it right this time, high power, low interest. And that's keep satisfied. That's the technique, keep them satisfied. So we mentioned when we were talking about stakeholders earlier on that the government would be a good example of a stakeholder with high power but low interest. Now, of course, they've got high power because they can impose laws, rules, and, of course, as you can see on screen, taxes. And the organization has to respect those laws and has to abide by them. But they're low interest because actually, compared with a full-time employee, the government has very little interest in the day-to-day running and the strategic changes of an individual organization. But, of course, should they decide to become interested in the business, they would have a huge amount of power. And so, in a bid to avoid them exercising their power, an organization should keep them satisfied. And they should do that by paying their taxes on time and by abiding by the law and making sure that all necessary information is given to them. So maybe the government needs profit information so they can assess the correct level of tax the organization should be paying. So again, we're grouping stakeholders in a way that keeps them satisfied, keeps them informed, so that they don't seek to increase their power over the organization. Let's zoom out now and let's zoom in again to our final category, which is high power, high interest. These are our key players, and we must keep our key players close because key players have a power to shape strategy and they have a high interest in how the organization is progressing. So again, this is another stakeholder we've already talked about vaguely. A CEO is very interested in receiving a good salary, and they can also exercise their power through voting in director meetings. So their interest in getting a good salary is reflected in being very interested in the organization, and their power is reflected in their ability to be able to vote in director meetings to shape and affect the organization. Now, as you can see on the title in front of you, key players mustn't be kept close. It's a bit of a tongue twister. Key players must be kept close. And so regular communication is maintained with them. And not only is communication maintained, because that kind of implies a passive, the organization letting the key players know what's happening. But in fact, in this instance, the key players' goals and objectives must be included as part of the organization's strategy setting process and business approach. Because, of course, if their objectives and goals aren't included in the organization's strategy from the get-go, from the off, and if it dissatisfies them, if it dissatisfies the key players, then of course they will have the ability to change it going along. And so it's much better to get their thoughts on board at the beginning of the process. Okay, so there is our Mendelow's matrix. Hopefully I've provided a really clear distinction between the four sets of classifications provided on the matrix. So I said at the beginning of the video that this is a really important tool that gets tested at all levels of the E's syllabus, the E pillar, so E1 right the way through to E3. Now, of course, it's the way you will be expected to display this knowledge that changes. The theory itself doesn't change. And so in the E1 syllabus, you'll be expected to display understanding and learning. So a simple question from the E1 exam may be to show understanding that keep satisfied is for stakeholders with high power but low interest. And you might be expected to match those two together. Now, as you progress through to the E3 syllabus, then you'll be expected to apply or analyze that information. So you might be given a scenario and then have to pick out the relevant stakeholders, and then you may have to analyze an organization's approach to those stakeholders based on how they've used Mendelow's matrix. So the theory doesn't change. You don't need to know anything more. It's just about the way you test it. So what I would advise is to practice those questions. So whatever syllabus you're doing, be sure to pick up one of our practice kits. And if you've liked today's video, please be sure to like it or even subscribe to our channel for more of these videos. Thank you very much. I hope you found today's short video interesting and useful, and good luck with the rest of your exams.